The Oral History and Criminology Project is pleased to present to you a conversation with Gary LaFree. We come to you here in March 2012 from his office here in the START Center, where he's director of the National Center for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism. He's also a founding member of the Democracy Collaborative here at the University of Maryland. Prior to coming to the University of Maryland, he spent 21 years or so at the University of New Mexico, where he worked his way from assistant professor all the way up to emeritus in the sociology department. While at the University of New Mexico, he also acted as director of the Institute for Social Research and also directed the New Mexico Criminal Justice Statistical Analysis Center at the Institute for Criminal Justice Studies. In 2006, he was honored as the ASC's president. And over the course of his career, he's been involved with a variety of research activity. The early portion dealt largely with, and correct me if I'm wrong here, criminal justice system processing issues before you segued into a great deal of research that looks at crime, homicide on a macro scale. I've rarely encountered anything quite as macro as your work. You've done work on international comparative kind of work, explored situational context, historical trends. You've done work on the great American crime decline, which you artfully refer to as the bust in one particular publication. You've explored collective violence and terrorism as well. You've also earned tens of millions of dollars in research funding and done invited lectures across the globe, and you've published in Spanish and you've published in all the right journals. But before you became the criminologist, the decorated criminologist that you are, you were just a history major at Indiana University. So what was it that brought you into the orbit of sociology and then subsequently into criminology? Were the questions that you were attempting to answer, were the people that were guiding you in this particular direction? What was it? What's the appeal?
Well, I actually started my undergraduate life planning to go to law school. So in those days, a lot of people, I guess in these days as well, lots of people planning to go to law school started out with a history major, which is what I did.
Yeah.
So I'm rolling along thinking that's where I'm heading, and this is back in the early 1970s.
Yeah.
And I then took a sociology course my junior year. It was on ethnomethodology.
Okay.
And I said, wow, this is really interesting.
Yeah.
And Indiana University had actually, their sociology department had quite a lot of people doing criminology in those days.
Yeah.
I mean, it was at one time the home of Edwin Sutherland and Linda Smith and lots of heavy hitters in the history of criminology. So pretty late in the program, I decided to get a double major in sociology.
All right.
And then I actually was so conflicted, I applied to both law schools and graduate schools when I graduated undergrad.
Graduate schools in sociology?
In sociology.
All right.
And I remember I was actually sitting in a restaurant outside the Indiana Law School back in 1973. I remember the exact moment this happened. And I saw a couple of young law students going into the building, and they were decked out in kind of like I'm wearing today. With briefcases, and I said, oh God, that looks boring. I don't think I want to go in that direction. And that was literally when I decided I'd already gotten accepted to law schools, but I decided to go into sociology.
Right.
So I didn't really plan to do criminology at that point, however. I just decided that sociology looked pretty interesting, and I thought it would be more fun to study than society rather than be a lawyer.
Yeah.
So then I started getting into all of the required courses, and I think Indiana did have quite a few people that were doing criminology and deviance work. And so basically I started, it's a fairly quantitative program. It was actually very survey focused.
Yeah.
The master's degree at Indiana, I'm not sure if it's still this way, but it used to be you had to be part of a thing called the Indianapolis Project, and you gathered data in the community, survey data, and then had to do your master's thesis on the data. So the whole class did work on the same, essentially, survey.
All right.
So mine happened to be on job satisfaction, which, was kind of random.
Yeah.
And so I'm casting about trying to decide what I want to do in terms of a specialty. And at that time I was taking quite a bit of structural classes, structuralism like Foucault, and the French structuralists like Sorel and some of those folks. And I started getting really interesting in Sorel and Foucault and others that talked about how individuals and societies use violence to get their way.
Yeah.
And so I started thinking this is a pretty interesting idea, and I didn't really know how to apply it. And then by accident, pretty much randomly, I picked up a copy of Susan Brownmiller's book on rape in 1975.
Right. Yeah.
And I said, wow, this is really, talk about a situation where individuals are using violence to get what they want, basically. Right. And I started thinking, well, this might be an interesting topic. And at the time, there was very little interest in this in the department, except the woman who ended up becoming my dissertation advisor, Barbara Reskin, who was then had been promoted herself, who later became the president of the American Sociological Society. She was willing to be a sponsor in this area. So I didn't have any data or anything yet, but then I started thinking, well, this would be an interesting idea to test. And then because of Indiana's emphasis on surveys, I actually spent a lot of time critiquing surveys. I still to this day am not wild about surveys because I feel like people, you interview them one day, I'm a lousy survey taker myself. You catch me in the morning, I'll give different answers. In the evening, you catch me on a good day. So I never really liked surveys, and I think, and again, the people like Foucault have a great critique of surveys, as do some of the linguistic critiques. So I was looking for something that would be more concrete.
Okay.
And I started looking at, for example, Foucault's notion of the archaeology of knowledge, and the idea that in a sense what we are as criminologists is archaeologists. We're going out and we're digging up this information from the past and trying to interpret it. We usually have incomplete information. Yeah. We usually have bits and pieces of the information. And I think probably, I didn't think of this at the time, but because of my history background, that sort of naturally led me to think of documents. And I started thinking, rape is actually a great example of this sort of documentary evidence because we actually have great information on cases, in rape cases. We know with pretty good certainty the characteristics of the offender or the suspect. We know characteristics of the person bringing the charges. We have good information on what happens in the system, what charges the police brought, what the grand jury did, what the preliminary hearing did, what the prosecution did, what sentence the person got, whether the person was convicted. Pretty good data on all that. At the time I'm thinking, I want something concrete. You could interview people about their attitudes towards rape and, what are you getting there? It's like epiphenomenal. But I started thinking, the cases are actually quite concrete. And this was, I think, important to me in terms of my introduction to criminology because I've really never done anything else. Everything I've done has been based on these big archives, essentially. Yeah. And the archive I used for my dissertation, and then I published on it for the first almost 10 years of my career, was initially I looked at about 1,000 cases of reported rape that got reported to the Indianapolis Police Department. Right. And then I just traced them through the records. And in the meantime, I was fortunate to get a job for the prosecutor of Marion County. In that point in time, there was a program called the Promise System, which was a system to collect prosecutor data. All right. And they hired me, so I actually had a badge. I had access to all of the records. I had police records, prosecution records, exactly. So I was only a graduate student, so I didn't have a lot of resources, but I had good access, and I was able to hire some undergraduate helpers. And we ended up coding 1,000 cases of rape from the time they were reported to the police, and then as they worked their way all the way through the system and ended up in prosecution, and it ended up in prison, actually. And that really helped me launch a career. So out of that project, I published in the American Sociological Review, pretty much all of the major journals in sociology. And at the time, there wasn't a lot of good empirical evidence in that area.
Now, how did you get from that to your latter work?
Well, I sort of, like I say, the connecting thread for me, I've really been influenced, I think, by my history background. Yeah. So I like finding evidence, documentary evidence of work. Yeah. So pretty much my entire career has been based on about 4 databases. I started out with this big database, I think to this day is the largest criminal justice database on rape that anybody, at least that I'm aware of, has ever collected. Yeah. I then moved to a similar big database on uniform crime reports for the entire United States going back to the 1950s.
All right.
Did a series of articles on that. Then I developed a huge database on international homicide from the World Health Organization. And in those days, none of this stuff was computerized, so I actually spent like 3 weeks.
So you had to build the data set essentially.
All in
Right.
each case. And then my work for the last
Yeah.
10 years has been on this terrorism database.
Yeah.
So, in a way, I've been a database builder my entire career.
And one of the things that I noticed about reading your work here is that there's a constant attempt to relate these to some of the big ideas in all of, well, history or sociology. So you see folks like Marx or Weber or Norbert Elias, and the more contemporary references are Ted Gurr, Tom Tyler, and Fukuyama. Do you see enough of that in criminology these days?
Yeah, that's a great question. In some ways, I think the challenge is from the time I was in the business.
Yeah.
When back in the 70s, virtually all criminologists really had sociology degrees.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so Indiana actually, the required courses included a lot of theory.
Yeah.
So I got great work with people like Larry Hazelrig on Marx and Weber, people like Whitney Pope, who knew more about Durkheim than anybody on the planet. He just had an encyclopedic knowledge of Durkheim. So good theoretical training. And we struggle with this here in our criminology program. So now we have there are lots of PhD programs that give criminology degrees, and they're not, they're certainly not the same as sociology programs. So the one concern is that we're not giving students that same kind of grounding in theory.
Yeah.
But that said, I also think there's some problems with where we're at with regard to theory, and I don't know, maybe we'll get a chance to talk about that in a bit.
You talk a little bit about the people that you encountered in Indiana. It does have a really rich storied history. There were a couple of really big names that came out of the graduate program too, as students at one time. Could you talk about both who mentored you and some of the colleagues that you may have encountered?
Yeah, it's funny in retrospect. We used to have a graduate student basketball team back in the day, and actually quite a few of those folks have gone on to be like presidents of the Sociology Society or of the Criminology Society. So Glenn Fireball, Mike Hout, Richie Felson, Ed Kick, so Doug Smith, who was here at Maryland for many years, Christy Vischer, who's been around for a long. Christy actually hired on one of the grants we had, actually. She was about a year behind me in graduate school. So yeah, and then some other people that are less well known in sociology, partly because, like Tim Stearns, who ended up going into business, is a professor of business now in California. Graham Tomlinson, who passed away some years ago. Chris Drass, who I used to work with, he passed away some years ago. Martha Myers, who I think is retired now. Meade Grigg, who's down in Florida. So yeah, it was a really good group. And Indiana had this model of, I think they admitted maybe 50 students in a cohort, so there were a lot of people.
Oh, wow.
A lot of whom did not finish, in fact. And then the faculty, I thought, was quite rich too. And in fact, in some ways, there were people that had just come through, like in criminology, that were, I think, like John Hagen in particular, had a big impact on me. And he wasn't at Indiana a long time, but I overlapped with him briefly.
He was there.
Yep.
That's incredible.
Ted Turk was there for many years.
Oh, wow.
Alfred Lindesmith was there for many years. But they also had this really great cohort of young people that I learned a lot from. And Barbara Reskin herself was not much older than me, actually. Charles Reagan, who's now at Arizona, was very active. David Snyder, who actually left for the stock market at some point, but he was very active. Bill Corsaro was very active. And then also some influential statisticians. I think Indiana did have a good statistical training unit. So George Bornstedt. In fact, my first TA job was with Carl Schuessler, who was, a very prominent statistician at the time. Eileen Bernstein was there. Was on my committee. Shel Stryker, Symbolic Interaction. He was on my committee as well. So there were a lot of good mentors. It was actually a large department too. It was probably 35 faculty when I was there.
Sheesh. Do you see any biographical references in terms of how things that may have happened to you or events that transpired that articulate themselves or manifest themselves in your research agenda?
Yes. Well, I mentioned one, I think. The fact that I came out of a program that very much emphasized survey research, ironically, ended up having me be very critical of surveys. And it defined my career in an odd way, in an oppositional way, because I think the critiques that some of the linguists and some of the sort of sociology of knowledge people give of surveys are devastating. I've always been nervous about surveys, so that pushed me to look for other sources of data, and probably my historical background got me to look at records. So records have, of course, their own problems, but I find I've got more confidence that you've got something concrete when you're studying records. So that was one. Something that happened, an event that was really, I think, very important for me. I'd already gotten to New Mexico, but I was a brand new assistant professor out there, was a program that actually was at the University of Maryland that was put together by Colin Lofton. It was funded by the Bureau of Justice Statistics and the Census Bureau, and it brought together a group of 6 criminologists and 6 statisticians for like boot camp to study the National Crime Victim Survey. And I came to this program 2 years, actually, 2 summers, and spent maybe, I think it was a couple of months for each of them. And it was a fabulous networking experience. I met Rob Sampson, Jim Lynch, Terry Meathy, Bob O'Brien, Gary Kleck. It was like a kind of who's who of, as this group matured. There were a lot of major folks in the field. Steve Messner came at one point, John Laub. I mean, a lot of people who became my good friends and are friends to this day came together for these summer workshops. And I haven't kept up as much with the statisticians that were there, but I just thought that was really a kind of a really transformative experience. And then, of course, coming to Maryland has also been transformative. And I've been here now for 12 years, and feel like I've really learned a lot from my colleagues. I think it's a great department, and we've had a really a lot of bright people, a lot of bright students coming through here. And another I might mention that New Mexico, I had another influence that I wouldn't have necessarily anticipated, which is a sort of Latin American influence. And New Mexico, for example, is, I think, maybe the only state in the U.S. that puts all of its official documents in both Spanish and English. It has a very strong Latino culture. And starting in the early 1980s, I had no previous background in Spanish, but I started trying to replicate some of the work that I was doing in English in Spanish-speaking countries, and it was really an interesting experience. And it's also the way I met a guy who I ended up working with a lot in subsequent years, Christopher Birkbeck, who was actually a professor at the Universidad de los Andes in Mérida, Venezuela. And we ended up doing several projects together over the years. And I think the thing that I learned about that is I'll never forget sitting in this remote part of Venezuela interviewing a woman about whether she'd been a crime victim. And we were trying to replicate the National Crime Victim Survey in Venezuela. And she's sitting there and she's saying, well, I'm not sure whether my chickens were stolen or whether they wandered off. And she didn't even know whether, she didn't know her age. I mean, you really realize that like doing research in much of the world is a very different experience than doing it in the United States, which is eventually got me very interested in doing these cross-national crime studies that I ended up spending quite a bit of time doing in subsequent years. So I thought, the other thing about Birkbeck that I think had a big impact on me is he was a geographer, and so I picked up sort of an interest in longitudinal work, I think, from my historical background. But then I added to this, after working with Birkbeck, who's got his master's degree at Oxford and then his graduate degree in Swansea in geography, I also picked up a real interest in spatial stuff, which I've kept to this day. A lot of the work I'm doing right now is spatial. And so I got a real appreciation initially of that from that experience, and also the cross-cultural element.
Do you see your work as being built around a single theme, or are there several that you've dabbled in? Or?
Yeah, I think probably the theme that to me, the basis of science is counting things.
Yeah, right.
You start
Yeah.
with counting things.
Yeah.
And most of the areas I've been really drawn to have been areas where people have not done yet a very good job of counting things.
Yeah.
And I guess maybe because I get bored easily, I've been really drawn to areas where we really haven't known. And rape was a great example.
Yeah.
It's back in the 70s. There was all of this stuff floating around. On the one hand, people were saying, it's exaggerated, it's not that big of an issue. On the other hand, you had people saying, 1 out of 2 people or 1 out of 2 women are victimized.
Yeah.
Nobody really knew that much about how it actually transpired, how it took place. I think the same is true for longitudinal crime data in the United States. We made some strides, but criminology has been almost totally a cross-sectional discipline.
Yeah.
It's now starting to, thankfully through the work of people like John Love and Rob Sampson and Terry Moffat and others, we're starting to get more longitudinal work, but that's pretty recent, and there hasn't been a big tradition of that. So I was really interested in, like when I started collecting and publishing uniform crime report stats, I had never seen them going back anywhere in print back as far back as I took them. I went all the way back to the beginning of the UCR in 1930. And likewise, I don't think anybody collected as much World Health Organization data from countries around the world as I did when I was doing that. And the same is true for terrorism now. We have the most comprehensive global database on terrorism on the planet. So, for better or worse, I guess some people would criticize me for putting the cart before the horse, but to be honest, I've always been drawn by these big data projects.
Yeah.
I feel, in a sense, like what's drawn me to criminology is more as an archaeologist. And we've ended up we've tried to do causal reasoning and tried to use the most recent methods, but in some ways what I've always been excited about is, oh my gosh, so this is what it looks like. This is how many cases drop out during rape prosecution.
Yeah.
This is how much homicide there is in countries that we never looked at before.
Yeah.
This is how much terrorism happens over time. So that's really been my life's work, really.
When I look at your work from the outside looking in, I just kind of want to see what you think of this. If I were to distill your work down into a couple different words, I would use words like democratization, modernization, or legitimacy in terms of the orienting mechanism.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. I think that's right. I think it's funny, having been in the business now for 40 years, it's kind of, in a way, probably it's humbling how few good ideas we actually have.
Yeah.
So I could go through maybe 2 or 3 ideas that I think I've had that I'm proud of.
Yeah.
And one of the first relates to this business on rape cases.
Yeah.
It's hard to remember this now, but back in the late 60s, early 70s, labeling theory was incredibly influential in sociology and in criminology.
Yes.
And so one of the ideas of labeling theory is that essentially, people who get convicted of crimes, including serious crimes like rape, that there's almost no relationship between what they've done and what happens to them.
Yeah.
And by the time I was coming along, there was actually a very strong critique of that. And some of my friends and colleagues, including people at Maryland, were among those that critiqued it. So the argument that critiqued that labeling idea that was most direct is that, but if you interview people and ask them to rank the severity of crimes, they almost universally, and even across society to some large extent, see homicide as more important than theft, and see rape as more important than say, a minor kind of burglary, which is taken to sort of refute the labeling thing. But the damn labeling theorists were, I think, absolutely right in the sense that when you're in the system, you have imperfect knowledge.
Yeah.
It may be true that people say, in fact, rape next to murder is the most serious penalties in our criminal justice system. The problem is, in a real case, you don't know what the hell is going on. And so, for a time, after I did this study with the police data, Barbara Retzkin and I got a National Institute of Mental Health grant to study rape juries. So for a while, I probably had the unenviable position of having seen more rape trials than any other person on the planet.
Yeah.
I mean, even judges, because we would cover all of these rape trials. And I'm telling you, if you used yourself as data in these cases, you couldn't tell what the hell was going on. I mean, it looked like this person was guilty, and then they'd have this airtight alibi.
All right.
So what you're doing is, I think, exactly what the jurors and other fact finders are doing. You're developing theories of what happened.
Yeah.
But you have totally incomplete information. Even after the trial, I had cases in the book that was eventually published, and I used to follow, I haven't done this now in years, but I actually, as far as 10 years after those studies, I actually would check with the prison system to see if these folks were still in prison.
Yeah.
And there were some cases that, I mean, they were terrible cases, but whether they got the right guy, I hate to bet my life on it.
Oh.
And the reverse,
Yeah.
cases where you figured probably the person did it, but he got away with it.
That's,
And the thing is, I think the labeling theorists had that ambiguity. The fact that crime is ultimately socially constructed is absolutely right. And what's so fascinating about it in the case of rape, and other crimes too, but rape's, I think, almost emblematic of this, is despite the fact that you got pretty damn good information on the victim, the offender, and the incident,
yeah.
you still don't know what the heck's going on. And it's particularly the case when the issue is consent. So a lot of times with consent cases, both parties agree to what's going on, but it's the interpretation of that that is so critical and is what's totally missing. So that actually, I just feel like that's an incredibly important aspect of all of the interpretations you do in criminology, and I do not think anyone has ever refuted that adequately with regard to labeling theory. So I'd say that's point number one.
Yeah.
Second point I'd say that I think was a pretty good idea was an idea that was eventually published in the book I did on legitimacy.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's not rocket science, but I'm still kind of proud of it. So I tracked all of these different crimes over time, and it dawned on me that if you look at all of the theories of crime,
Yeah.
like the United States is a great example of this. From 1961 to 1973, homicide rates doubled, robbery rates tripled, burglary rates quadrupled. So you say, how can biology
Sure.
possibly
Right.
explain that? How can psychology? And you know, one of the dominant theories in sociology is the sort of cultural explanations.
Yeah.
And so, you know, culture, according to this, is it's passed on relentlessly, generation. You know, it's impossible to break the poverty cycle, etc. And yet, crime rates are changing, and the reverse is now true. I mean, since about 2000, we've had this huge drop-off in crime. So that tells me that theoretically, we've got to find something that changes rapidly. And to me, and I link this back to the earlier experience with social construction. So I thought, it's a social construction, and that's what really leads me to Weber and legitimacy.
All right.
It's got to be something that changes pretty rapidly, and it's based on essentially a fundamental challenge of the system. And that actually led then into others cross-national work, and as you referred to earlier, on booms and busts and that kind of work, which I'm still interested in, even with regard to terrorism. So I think that was an important thing, and I think kind of a clever thing. And then I guess I'll just give two more examples of things that I'm proud of. One, when I started in the business, it was pretty difficult to do etiological studies looking at race and crime. It was too inflammatory. A lot of the whole labeling tradition brought out race in terms of victimization and race in terms of disproportionate representation of the system, but etiology was a delicate topic. I think that's actually changed to some large degree. So I felt like when I started doing work looking at black and white crime rates in the United States, you know, I was actually a little nervous about it and its implications myself. But I think what I picked up there that I think I'm sort of pleased with is that we've found that if you look at black and white crime rates in the United States and you look at how they're trending over time, that we can sort of extrapolate it in almost a mathematical way that as the gap between the things that predict crime best, like inequality, poverty, female-headed households, as those get narrower for blacks and whites, so do crime rates. They sort of follow in lockstep.
Yeah.
so that you can predict a convergence is more likely in those areas where those things are getting closer together. And then finally, I guess I'll just give one example from terrorism work. When we got started collecting terrorism data, which is now almost 10 years ago, nobody on the planet had ever collected domestic terrorism data. Like the US State Department and other big research projects only looked at international terrorism. And we didn't really know how much domestic terrorism there was on the planet. And now that we actually have data on it, it turns out it's wildly important, that it's probably 9 times more or 10 times more important than international cases. And one of the things that I'm proud of in terms of sort of working in this field is that we've established pretty definitively that essentially that 911 is an incredibly rare event. It's a kind of black swan event because the vast majority of terrorism in our database is by a group that is in one country, a domestic group that's attacking targets in the same country. So we did a study a couple years ago, in fact, where we actually didn't look at all terrorism. We just looked at the 53 terrorist organizations that the US State Department said were the worst threats to the US. And so these are not a random sample, but groups that you'd think are especially dangerous to the US. Well, it turns out something like 96% of their attacks are not on the US, but they're on domestic targets. So you have a group in Pakistan attacking in Pakistan, which I think is incredibly important because it tells you that if you do counter-terrorism in a particular country, the biggest beneficiary is going to be the country you do it in, because these international attacks are fortunately pretty rare. So I'd say those in each area, I hope we've sort of moved knowledge forward and hopefully set up some research challenges for the next generation.
Now, what do you see terrorism as a research agenda as it relates to criminology? Is it entirely separate, or are they merging together, or are they're completely integrated in your mind?
I definitely wouldn't say integrated. And it's interesting that terrorism, I think, has really been, until quite recently, really has been neglected by criminologists. Before 911, in fact, and I could actually list this as a big impact on my career too, is the National Consortium of Violence Research, NCOVR, which Al Blumstein ran for about 12 years, funded by the National Science Foundation. It brought together researchers and was this great networking tool, but near the end of NCOVR, I got a small grant from the organization to bring together some researchers to look at terrorism. And I'll never forget, we were in a national NCOVR meeting, and I'm doing this presentation on terrorism, and just for the heck of it, I asked this group of criminologists there, I said, well, how many of you think we should even be studying this? And I'd say it was about 50-50. And I think it's probably much better integrated than that. In the last 10 years, there are now routinely sections on terrorism at the national meetings, at the criminology meetings. There's a lot of published work on terrorism in the journals. We're training, we got a whole new generation of criminologists who are looking at terrorism as well as other.
Now, does criminology have the conceptual tools to deal with these kinds of things, or is it developing them?
I think it's developing them. And I think actually there's a lot, I think it's interesting. In fact, when we got the START Center going, one of the big things I had in mind is that we should bootstrap by borrowing good ideas from other disciplines. And so one of the strong ideas we had is that we should use criminology, which is relatively well developed in terms of theory, to help understand terrorism. So we've tried to import a lot of criminology theories to try to understand more rapidly terrorism research, which actually did not have a well-developed theoretical tradition. So I think terrorism research has been aided by criminological theory. What I hadn't really expected, though, is to what extent it's a kind of a two-way street, because now I've been working in this area enough that I think there's some really good insights that criminologists can get from studying terrorism as well. For example, we're just worked on a couple of articles that were just in the Journal of Quantitative Criminology, where one of the characteristics of terrorism, the word I love is bursty. Terrorism is often bursty. In other words, you tend to get a lot of it in the same places in a short period of time. Improvised explosive devices are notoriously bursty. So if in Iraq, for example, when insurgents came up with a place of locating these things that worked, they used it a lot until something happened to stop them. So we've been developing, I've been working with one of my graduate students, Brandon Bailendorf, and developed this notion of microcycles, where we've looked at terrorism and said, well, how much of it happens, how much of it's bursty, how much of it happens in a very short amount of time and in the same rough area. And we've actually then taken that as a dependent variable and tried to say, well, what predicts whether it's bursty or not? And we found huge differences. Like bombings tend to be bursty. So when they come up with a good way of doing bombings, ETA, for example, will use it a lot until the government figures it out and does an effective response. On the other hand, assassinations are not bursty for the most part. They tend to be one-off, isolated phenomena in time and space. And I think this has actually a lot of implications for criminology that we're just beginning to explore. We know, for example, that burglaries are bursty. That if you get burglarized, your chances of a repeat, which we call in criminology a near repeat phenomenon, they go up dramatically. But also it has implications for your whole neighborhood, that everybody is more at risk if your house gets burglarized. And that gradually erodes over time. But it looks very much like this kind of terrorism pattern. In fact, I was at a conference a while ago, and we had slides of improvised explosive devices in Baghdad, gang violence in Los Angeles, and burglaries in Chicago. And I'm telling you, you couldn't have picked out which was which. They all congregate along major highways. They're all bursty. They're all concentrated spatially, of course, but also concentrated in time. So I think there's going to be a lot of benefits in both directions between terrorism research and criminology. I think it'll be a two-way street. I think it's already starting to be that way.
That's good to hear. Looking back on your career, is there anything that you may have done differently that...
Yeah, so...
not necessarily regret, but
that's a great question. It probably almost does rise to that. Well, I would say right now, if I were coming back through again, I would load up on all of the econometrics I could get. Economists have great time series skill, and I got a bit of that in graduate school, but not nearly enough, and I've had to self-teach myself a bit since then. But I just think more and more we need to do longitudinal work. So almost everything I've been doing is longitudinal, and I just think economists have some great methods that we should do. I would also say that I think it's, and I actually, it wouldn't be, I suppose, a regret, but I would say at least as much as I've done, and maybe even more, I think it's important to stick with a database. I think because we're training our students, and they're under so much pressure to get a lot of stuff out, that a lot of people, there's so much emphasis on getting publications at any cost that I think it just takes so long to understand the nuances, and you get more sophisticated by really getting to know a database. Now, I mean, there are limits, My limit is generally boredom, that I just get tired and I want to do something more fun. But I think you really want to spend enough time to really get the most that can be gotten out of a particular database. And probably something else that I probably in hindsight would have done more is I had these great intellectual resources. I wished I'd used them more than I did. I was probably too hard-headed and went out on my own more than I should have. I could have learned more from my mentors. So I would probably recommend people. Some people are better at that than I was, and I think I probably could have learned even more from mentors than I did.
Speaking of mentors, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the mentees that you've been responsible for over the years.
Yeah, well, I've got a great batch right now. A lot of the folks working at the START Center, I feel like are going to make good contributions to the field. Aaron Miller and Brandon Bailendorf, two young criminology students that should be graduating in a year or so, I think, have been really good. And then some recent graduates, Stephanie DiPietro, who's at UMSL now, I think is really doing well. Bianca Bersani, I'm working with now, in fact, who's at UMass Boston. A few of the folks from New Mexico that I work with quite a bit, I think are really doing some good work. Aki Roberts, who's still at New Mexico. Gwen Honeycutt, who's at NC State. Christine Rack, who's at New Mexico. Nancy Morris, who's at Virginia Commonwealth. And some other folks too. I think they'll all make their own mark, actually.
Now, when you think about the state of criminology, your presidential pushed in a direction in terms of expanding criminology's domain in a variety of different aspects there. Now, how has it met that call to action?
Well, of course, that speech was not too long ago. That's a great question, because I was pushing in the talk for example, more longitudinal work.
Yeah. That requires an enormous effort.
It does require an enormous effort. It also requires a sustained effort.
Yeah, sure.
And it kind of fits back with this database question. But you think of, the impact that, for example, Laub and Sampson have had with a database that goes back as far as that. And you just cannot recreate that.
Yeah.
So, if I were starting over, I would really think about developing a database like Terry Thornberry, for example, Terry Moffat. I've done a project with Richard Aram at NYU where we used the census data going back to 1930 that sort of created a long longitudinal database. All of the databases I've worked on have been longitudinal in one way or another. Certainly the U.S. homicide, U.S. crime, international homicide, terrorism data. I just think that's incredibly important. I also feel, having now been in the business for 40 years, I think criminology is actually I think we're in a theoretical crisis. In the sense that it's not right that we have the same, that if you pick up a criminology theory textbook now, it's the same damn book I had, although maybe a couple of things added. I don't think that's a good model. I think the economists, ironically, have done much better than we have, I think, in terms of public policy, because they have one theory that pretty much everybody subscribes to. Now, unfortunately, I don't think their theory is very good, but what's good about that is they're able to sort of gather around it and then sort of see where the weaknesses and strengths are.
The question for me, though, is that does criminology even recognize that it's in a crisis?
Probably not.
We'll get us to that point where we would recognize this, and then that would generate some conversation about what we do about this.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's huge disagreements about what I've just said. In fact, it's interesting. We have a panel at the sociology meetings in Denver this year that's on this theme, and I think Rob Sampson's on the panel. So it'll be interesting to see what a group of criminologists have to say about it. But it strikes me as that when no theory ever goes away, when every theory seems to be, impervious to being, that, if we took our best shot, and there's been some work at theory integration, but so far it has been not entirely successful. So I think that's a real challenge. And I guess the reason I think it's a crisis is just look at how we've done compared to, say, economics. I mean, everything from salaries, you look at salary structures in the economists. Now, I think we've actually done better than sociology in many ways, which I think has actually taken a real hit in the last 30 years. So I think we have that problem. I think we also still have, we're like the Rodney Dangerfield, we can't get any respect. I don't know what the hell that's about, because I used to think it was because we're applied. But you look at programs in, say, public health.
Could it be a result of predictability? Do we lack predictive potential that maybe the economists can lay better claim to, or they have a better toolkit?
Except you and I both know that economists are pretty crummy at predicting things. And so, public health is a relatively new discipline, and it seems, in my limited exposure to it, seems like it gets more sort of respect, I suppose. And I think, part of that is perhaps, I think we've got a real challenge, bizarrely enough, in that we are still linked. We're still, in a sense, a social problem discipline.
Yes.
Like, I think way back when we first started seeing glimmerings that crime rates were going to go down dramatically, I started thinking to myself, well, if crime rates go down dramatically, what's going to happen to research funding?
Yeah. Yeah.
And, I think research funding has plummeted, that it's actually a pretty tough market to get research funding in criminology right now. So we're linked in a way. I don't think that happens so much in medicine.
Yeah.
Maybe it's because they move from one, they sort of solve one problem, but they have got another one behind it. But I mean, we still have this sort of identity as a social problem, which means we're vulnerable to sort of changes. And that's really true with terrorism research too,
Yeah.
I think. So that's a bit tricky. I think another huge issue, and if I were going to give my biggest disappointment in criminology, it would be that when I was a graduate student 40 years ago, I'm sort of imagining the future, and I'm thinking, what are things going to be like in 2012? I thought we would have tons of good data, and that is not the case.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think we probably have worse crime data now than we had back in 1970. The Uniform Crime Report is clearly worse. I mean, it's been not collected adequately. The National Crime Victim Survey has been slipping. It's getting less funding each year, and it's more problematic than it used to be. The big self-report crime surveys, like the one that Dell Elliott worked on in Colorado for many years, I don't think are being funded anymore. So you could argue whether things are worse, but I would certainly say they're no better.
Yeah.
And particularly in longitudinal areas. I mean, unless you collect your own data.
Yeah.
And this is a huge irony, in a sense, in a period where we have this explosive growth in data. Why it is that crime data have lagged behind in many respects. So I think that's a huge challenge for us. I hope in 40 more years it's going to be better. And then I guess a last concern about criminology is, even though criminology is fundamentally interdisciplinary, once we get our criminology program set up, we're just like every other academic department, and we're so damn insular. And I think we have so much to learn from geography, from economics.
Yeah.
And I don't want to exaggerate this. Of course, a lot of criminologists are doing good work and learning, but I think pushing that even more than we have. This is one of the real joys of working in an interdisciplinary center, that I've just learned so much from working with people across other disciplines. So I'd say in terms of where criminology is right now, those are probably my biggest issues.
Okay. Are we in a pretty good spot, just professionally speaking, in terms of our
I think
intellectually and in terms of what we're able to accomplish in terms of policy?
I think we probably have made some gains there. I mean, for better or worse, the field, I think, is clearly moving to a freestanding emphasis on criminology programs.
Yeah.
And one metric of that is undergraduate enrollments, which have been incredibly good for criminology. And a while back, in fact, the New York Times had a fascinating article that I think, without a doubt, criminology has been the largest growing undergraduate major in the country. And so most programs have tons of students and lots of interest. And I haven't seen that. I mean, it's not countries. I think it's changing, although sometimes when I read the stats, I'm not positive about that. But I mean, there are fascinating issues in all parts of the world. I mean, maybe we'll find that a lot of those issues are no different wherever we study them, but in some cases, I suspect we will find different.
Now, is the international comparative element becoming much more expressed within criminology?
Well,
I presume that there's more data available now than there was to a generation ago.
Probably, although the international data has also been quite disappointing.
Yeah.
The United Nations has been a total disappointment, I think.
Yeah.
And in fact, one of the reasons that got me going with this terrorism stuff is I've been doing all this work on comparative homicide.
Yeah.
And basically, until pretty recently, and I think the jury is still out, I just got back from a conference that Mike Tonry organized in Italy, where we were talking about some new international crime sources that may change this picture. But pretty recently, you could only get reliable homicide data on probably 30 to 40 countries of the world, and in this century, which is pretty discouraging. And I know in the Criminologist, the newsletter, not too long ago, there was some work that I think Rosemary Barbary had put this together, where she was looking at the proportion of ASC panels that were international. And I think her conclusion was that they hadn't been increasing. I think they also looked at publications. So that was a little discouraging. It strikes me that there has been some improvement there, but it's not as much as you would think. And it's still very difficult to fund international work through criminology. I mean, certainly the National Institute of Justice, I think they've done away with their international funding, for example. I don't think they're funding any international work. And who else is funding it? I mean, it's pretty limited. So I think that's it's an area that's rich. I think other parts of the world are getting more. What's really exciting about American criminology is, I think if you flip forward 40 years, I think American criminology, and I don't want this to sound jingoistic, but I think it's going to be the model that's left standing. I mean, in other words, the quantitative, empirically driven kind of criminology that sort of originated at the University of Chicago has now become the dominant paradigm in American criminology. It's getting picked up now. In Holland, the Netherlands have several very quantitative programs. The UK, of course, places like Cambridge and Oxford, and in other parts of Europe. And I think this model is probably going to spread. I, in fact, just saw that there's several interesting economists in France that are doing criminology work, Italy. So you're starting to get this, where it had been a kind of much more of a qualitatively oriented criminology in other parts of the world. I think that's changing, and I think the U.S. model is actually going to be quite influential there.
Interesting. I guess we've talked about the past, the middle, and the future, and what's left on the horizons. Anything else you'd like to contribute for posterity here?
Yeah, great question. Well, I just think it's been a really interesting ride. And, it's a small field, but it's actually one that it's never been boring along the way. So I've really enjoyed it.
Well, we thank you for your time.
Yeah, my pleasure.
This has been great. So did the democracy collaborative eventuate in this? Is that
what happened? It is, but it isn't a direct forerunner. What happened? It's kind of funny how life goes. I was working on the Democracy Collaborative, and one of the things I was supposed to be a rainmaker, so I was looking for grant opportunities. And while I was doing that, I stumbled into this terrorism database. What originally happened is the thing that became the Global Terrorism Database was originally collected by the Pinkerton Global Intelligence Service, which was a relatively old Pinkerton.
Around?
They are still around.
Oh wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, they do all sorts of work, and they used to collect this terrorism data. And what they would do is hire ex-Air Force intelligence officers. So they retire from the Air Force, and then they go to work for this private company collecting terrorism data. And they've been doing, in fact, there were quite a few companies doing something similar. And all the way back to the late 1960s. So it turns out, I went down to their offices in Northern Virginia. This is before 911, actually. And I started talking to the local chief manager, and I said, I think academics would really be interested in this research you've got. And by accident, they had just decided that they weren't going to support that business any longer. And so they allowed me to move all of their files here. Okay. And so then we were sitting on all this terrorism data, but it was in shoe boxes. Yeah. So then I went to NCover and got a small grant to start bringing together some terrorism experts. Then I got a grant from the National Institute of Justice to start computerizing the data. All right. And then 911 hit, and Homeland Security started the Center of Excellences. And so by then I had... So then you're the world's foremost expert at that point, right? So just by sort of serendipity. Well, and we'd already put together a team. Sure, yeah. And I had the NCover model to sort of structure it. And we had a kind of database, which in fact, the timing of this interview is interesting because yesterday, the State Department approached us to use the Global Terrorism Database as the government's chief database on terrorism to replace the government's database. So we've actually become the
definitive
global
source, I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And all that's happened, over the space of 10 years, but driven by events at 9/11 especially.
One of the things I kind of wanted to talk to you about, I'm afraid I was going to belabor the point there in the course of the interview, is that what are the structural constraints to gathering data these days? It seems like there are.
I think it's changing, although sometimes when I read the stats, I'm not positive about that. But I mean, there are fascinating issues in all parts of the world. I mean, maybe we'll find that a lot of those issues are no different wherever we study them, but in some cases I suspect we will find different.
Now, is the international comparative element becoming much more expressed within criminology?
Well,
I presume that there's more data available now than there was to a generation ago.
Probably, although the international data has also been quite disappointing.
Yeah.
The United Nations has been a total disappointment, I think.
Yeah.
And in fact, one of the reasons that got me going with this terrorism stuff is I've been doing all this work on comparative homicide.
Yeah.
And basically, until pretty recently, and I think the jury is still out, I just got back from a conference that Mike Tonry organized in Italy, where we were talking about some new international crime sources that may change this picture. But pretty recently, you could only get reliable homicide data on probably 30 to 40 countries of the world in this century, which is pretty discouraging.
Yeah.
And I know in the Criminologist, the newsletter, not too long ago, there was some work that I think Rosemary Barbaret had put this together, where she was looking at the proportion of ASC panels that were international. And I think her conclusion was that they hadn't been increasing. I think they also looked at publications.
Wow.
So that was a little discouraging. It strikes me that there has been some improvement there, but it's not as much as you would think. And it's still very difficult to fund international work through criminology. I mean, certainly the National Institute of Justice, I think they've done away with their international funding, for example. I don't think they're funding any international work. And who else is funding it? I mean, it's pretty limited. So I think that's it's an area that's rich. I think other parts of the world are getting more. What's really exciting about American criminology is I think if you flip forward 40 years, I think American criminology, and I don't want this to sound jingoistic, but I think it's going to be the model that's left standing. I mean, in other words, the quantitative, empirically driven kind of criminology that sort of originated at the University of Chicago has now become the dominant paradigm in American criminology. It's getting picked up now. In Holland, the Netherlands have several very quantitative programs. The UK, of course, places like Cambridge and Oxford, and in other parts of Europe. And I think this model is probably going to spread. I, in fact, just saw that there's several interesting economists in France that are doing criminology work, Italy. So you're starting to get this, where it had been a kind of much more of a qualitatively oriented criminology in other parts of the world. I think that's changing, and I think the U.S. model is actually going to be quite influential there.
Interesting. I guess we've talked about the past, the middle, and the future, and what's left on the horizon. Is there anything else you'd like to contribute for posterity here?
Yeah, great question. Well, I just think it's been a really interesting ride. And, it's a small field, but it's actually one that it's never been boring along the way. So I've really enjoyed it.
Well, we thank you for your time.
Yeah, my pleasure.
This has been great. So did the democracy collaborative eventuate in this? Is that
what happened? It is, but it isn't a direct forerunner. What happened? It's kind of funny how life goes. I was working on the Democracy Collaborative, and one of the things I was supposed to be a rainmaker, so I was looking for grant opportunities. And while I was doing that, I stumbled into this terrorism database. What originally happened is the thing that became the Global Terrorism Database was originally collected by the Pinkerton Global Intelligence Service, which was a relatively old
Pinkerton. Around?
They are still around.
Oh wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, they do all sorts of work, and they used to collect this terrorism data. And what they would do is hire ex-Air Force intelligence officers. So they retire from the Air Force and then they go to work for this private company collecting terrorism data. And they've been doing, in fact, there were quite a few companies doing something similar. And all the way back to the late 1960s. So it turns out, I went down to their offices in Northern Virginia. This is before 911, actually. And I started talking to the local chief manager, and I said, I think academics would really be interested in this research you've got. And by accident, they had just decided that they weren't going to support that business any longer. And so they allowed me to move all of their files here.
Okay.
And so then we were sitting on all this terrorism data, but it was in shoe boxes.
Yeah.
So then I went to NCover and got a small grant to start bringing together some terrorism experts. Then I got a grant from the National Institute of Justice to start computerizing the data.
All right.
And then 911 hit. And Homeland Security started
That's
the
incredible.
Center of Excellences. And so by then I had...
So then you're the world's foremost expert at that point, right? So just by sort of serendipity.
Well, and we'd already put together a team.
Sure, yeah.
And I had the NCover model to sort of structure it. And we had a kind of database, which in fact, the timing of this interview is interesting because yesterday, the State Department approached us to use the Global Terrorism Database as the government's chief database on terrorism to replace the government's database. So we've actually become the
definitive
global
source, I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And all that's happened, over the space of 10 years, but driven by the events at 911 especially.
One of the things I kind of wanted to talk to you about, I'm afraid I was going to belabor the point there in the course of the interview, is that what are the structural constraints to gathering data these days? It seems like there are